The Catholic Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio ascended to the papacy in 2013. In honor of the Catholic saint Francis of Assisi, he chose as his papal name Francis. For a dozen years, he was the head of the Catholic Church and a major figure in the moral and cultural life of the West. After a prolonged illness, Pope Francis died on April 21st of this year. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. Why on this program, dedicated to Jewish ideas, Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish public affairs, why should we take up a discussion about the late Pope and the future of the Catholic Church? Well, there are over 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. They play a significant role in the production of Western culture and Western opinion. The foundational structures of Europe are derivative of or inseparably woven into the history of the Catholic Church. And whether the Pope strengthens or undermines the moral confidence of Western nations matters. It mattered during the papacy of John Paul II during the Cold War. It mattered in the confrontation with jihadist terror during the papacy of Benedict XVI. It cannot but be a factor in the horizons of Western civilization. This week we look at a particular dimension of the late Pope Francis's legacy, which is how he engaged the Jewish people, Israel, and the Middle East. My guest is the Catholic priest, Father Benedict Kiely. Father Ben was born in London, ordained in Canterbury, and although he spent most of his ministry in the United States, is perhaps the most Scrutonian Catholic priest I know. He has a special insight into our subject. Father Ben founded in 2014 a charity called Nazarene.org, whose aim is to support persecuted Christians around the world. He's got a special focus on the plight of Christians in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. As you'll hear in our conversation today, Father Ben would like to see the Church grow closer to its Middle Eastern roots, and that means, in some grand, spiritual way, closer to its Jewish roots. Now, before I bring you this week's conversation, let me make two other notes. First, I want to acknowledge that for Catholics, the question of the Church's attitude toward Zionism and Israel is not perhaps among the most pressing of ecclesiastical priorities. I would not expect it to weigh heavily on the Vatican's conclave to elect the next pope. Even though Catholics can understand why this particular set of questions is of interest to their Jewish friends, I realize that I'm coming into this conversation as an outsider. Second, I know very well that there are very deep theological matters that will always divide the Catholic Church from the Jewish people. Some of those very deep theological matters also shape the way that Catholics tend to think about Zionism and the modern state of Israel. The Jewish people are animated by a belief in covenantal chosenness and the sacred obligation that we have to uphold God's ways in our actions, in our families, and in our nation. That obligation is structured by tradition and law, and it is expressed nationally in the people of Israel, which, after a long hiatus in exile, again has a sovereign state in the land of our fathers. For Catholics, of course, the Church is the new Israel, and despite very welcome and laudable developments since the promulgation of Nostra Aetate in 1965, that is an unbridgeable theological chasm. Even so, friendship between Christians and Jews is essential to revitalizing the civilization that we built together, the civilization that we share, and the civilization we are responsible for handing down to our children. This week, Father Ben is my guest to help us think about the legacy of Pope Francis, the Church's engagement in the Middle East, and some of his own intriguing thoughts on the next Catholic Pope. If you enjoy this conversation, you can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Father Benedict Kiely. Father Benedict Kiely, welcome to the Tikvah podcast.
Thank you, John, very much for having me.
So, of course, we're meeting and having this conversation soon after the death of the Pope. And I thought that in light of his passing, it makes sense for us to take stock of the state of the Church, the state of Jewish-Catholic relations, Catholic engagement in the Middle East, and there's no better person that I could invite on to help us understand these things than you. Maybe you could just say a word, as you understand it, about Pope Francis his legacy in these areas and his legacy in general. When you think of him, what do you think of?
Well, thank you for your condolences. The Catholic world obviously is in a period of mourning, but we also are moving onwards. We know that the Pope had been very ill for some time, and particularly in the last couple of months, and so it was no surprise, plus his age. And so while we are sad at his passing, we're also at his death, we're also moving on without undue haste, but beginning to think very seriously about who the next pope will be. We've heard that the conclave will begin on May the 5th, which is fairly soon. So all the Catholic world and the rest of the world, the media, is beginning to talk about candidates, which is always a little bit dangerous because the old phrase is whoever goes into the conclave, a pope, comes out a cardinal. So when they say, "Well, this man is definitely going to be the pope," that's unlikely. But
Right.
Francis's legacy is, it's especially in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations, is a little confused because when we look back to say a figure like John Paul II, for Catholics, Saint John Paul II, this man was a giant in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations. He's massively changed Catholic-Jewish relations single-handedly. Francis less so. Interesting, he's continued the work of dialogue, for example. One or two of his statements I know have been difficult for many Jewish people, especially during the war in Gaza, for example. So his record in that area is a little bit more. It's not very clear, perhaps we could say. He didn't say or do anything dramatic in that world, but it's certainly not as clear, not as clear either as Benedict XVI, who also continued very much John Paul II's incredible work.
Of course, for Catholics, the question of Jewish Catholic relations is necessarily not the most important thing. It's not even among the, I don't know, top 100 most important things, I would say. When considering the leadership of the church, its theological, cultural, civilizational, strategic impulses and direction. But of course, you can understand how for the Jewish community, our interest in the question does center on such matters. And I think that the statements that the Pope did offer and gestures that I think he intended to be statements during Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza, I think were indeed troubling and sort of leave the impression that not so much as it relates to specific questions of Zionism and Jewish nationalism, but rather a question about which side of the civilizational gulf this Pope saw himself. Because the way that Jews tend to understand our conflict with Hamas in Gaza is that we are standing up not only for our neighbors and brothers and sisters, but also as the fighting front line of a civilization that we share.
I agree, and I think the Pope, this last Pope, was a difficult man to pin down. Obviously, he's Latin American. When I was thinking about this conversation earlier on, I was beginning to think that, of course, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, a Pole and a German, were both men who were formed as young men in the Second World War. Francis was not. His post Second World War, and the next pope will certainly be a man, virtually certainly a man who was born after the Second World War. So I think that might perhaps be an unconscious part of this, that those two men, those previous men, were formed by that civilizational conflict, which the Second World War was, and of course the Holocaust and a reaction to that. And so Francis, he confused he confused a lot of Catholics as well as and Catholics and Jews, and also, as you said, that perhaps Catholic-Jewish relations are not high on the list. They should be, because one of my problems, as you know, I work to help Christians in the Middle East in particular who are being persecuted, mainly by Islam. But that's also sadly not high on the list of priorities for Catholics, which would be probably a surprise to many of your viewers and listeners, that the persecution of the church is not an important issue. In fact, in America, a Catholic charity did a poll a couple of years ago, and the persecution of the church, a listing of five important things, the persecution of the church was not in the top five, or maybe it was the bottom of the top five, but things like climate change were above that. And to me, that's rather a tricky thing in the question of the civilizational conflicts of the world. So I think Catholic Jewish relationships are very important and should be more part of the conversation for Catholics.
Well, maybe we should step into some of your own engagement, your own work in the Middle East. I think this will be new to many of listeners to this program. Father Ben, I think it would make sense if you could to just give us a tour of the not comprehensively, but so that we have the context of the history of Catholic communities in the Middle East, the areas of greatest Catholic concentration today, the threats they face. Why don't you just invite us into your work in that world?
Thank you. Yes, if we did it intensively, we'd need another hour at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, you look across for your listeners and viewers, the Christian presence in the Middle East, Catholic Christian presence, has been there from the beginning, from the time of Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, in Israel, Palestine, he and his disciples walked through what we would call Syria, what we would call Lebanon today. Jesus and his family were in Egypt when they were driven out by Herod at the beginning as a baby. The Copts in Egypt, the Coptic Christians, say that Jesus and his family were there for 3 years and 11 months. They're very exact. It's 3 years and 11 months. I was just in Egypt and I was told that. So across the Middle East, Christians have been there. Iraq, for example, where I've been many, many times. Jesus's disciples founded the church in Iraq. So Christians have been there for 2,000 years across the Middle East. Since the time of Islam, again, truth has to be told in charity. Since the time of the rise of Islam, Christians in the Middle East have been constantly and consistently persecuted in varying levels of persecution, periods of calm, periods of tolerance, and then periods of intense persecution, mass slaughter, etc. At the moment, in Egypt is the largest Christian community in the Middle East, possibly around 20%. There's argument the government figures and Coptic Christian figures differ, but probably at least 20 million Christians in Egypt. Also, who have suffered from the beginning periods of calm, but even just in the last few years, in 2016, 17, were bombings of churches in Egypt, slaughter of Christians. The other thing is, all across the Middle East, where Muslims are the majority, which is basically all of the Middle East except Israel, Christians are second-class citizens. In law, they're second-class citizens, but also in so many other ways. It's what's called dimitude, as we know, where they're always second-class citizens, and they've had to endure that for centuries. So part of the work, my work and the work of the church, but my work in particular, is to help the world know about what's happening to Christians across the globe, but also particularly in the Middle East, to help Christians stay in their homelands by supporting them economically, by helping start start jobs, family businesses. We mini microfinance small family businesses to keep Christians there, because that also helps with the migration problem. That if Christians leave, they're heading towards Europe or to the United States or Australia, but they will then empty out of the place they've been for 2,000 years, and so that's not a good thing at all.
Father Ben, tell us your own story into this kind of mission.
Well,
When did you begin to go to the Middle East? How did you begin to dimension this question? Tell us some of the stories of your time there.
I was a parish priest, just running a parish, Catholic parish in Stowe, Vermont. I was in America. I'm still a legal resident of the United States. My charity's based there. I'm in England at the moment. And your listeners can hear probably that I am English. But it was very simple. I was in 2014, when ISIS was spreading across Iraq and Syria. I remember hearing that for the first time in 2,000 years, Mosul, the city of Mosul in Iraq, which is Nineveh from the Bible, and we remember that the prophet Jonah preached in Nineveh, and his tomb is in Nineveh, although ISIS blew it up. I've seen it. I remember hearing on the news just that for the first time in 2,000 years there would be no mass, no Sunday Christian Catholic mass, Orthodox mass in Mosul because ISIS had taken over. And I just thought, this is terrible. What can we do? So I just spoke to some people and we started to try and think how we could help. Just at that stage, it was feeding and housing. I went to Iraq for the first time in early 2015 when ISIS was just down the road from Erbil in Iraq, and there were thousands and thousands of Christian refugees. Um, and then from then on, went back
You
several
must have
times.
traveled with security. With how did you
No,
arrange it?
no, it's funny because I was on the plane. You know how obviously you get a seat, and the first thing was getting on the plane from Vienna to Erbil, and the stewardess, the air, whatever they're called today, I don't know what the politically correct term is, but air something or other, whatever they're called. Um, she said, "You sit wherever you want," because the plane was pretty empty. It was basically a Catholic priest, me, and a lot of guys who looked rather like they might be special forces. You know, they're in khakis and with beards and everything, Americans. So, um, no, no security. The only time I've ever had security, funnily enough, was when I was with a journalist friend. We got into Mosul in 2018, just after ISIS had been driven out, although there was still a lot of people there and there were bombs and bodies, but we did have then armed guards, etc. But no, normally fairly safe. There have been a few tricky times, and people are fairly, unless they are real Islamists, people are fairly respectful towards a priest. I'm dressed as a priest and in the garb of a priest.
Mhm.
So I've never felt particularly unnerved. Once or twice, but no, it's just a wonderful thing though to see people. People are very like the Jews. People are very proud of their land. Their inheritance is incredibly important to them. The fact that they've lived there for so long is incredibly important, and they have a sense which we in America and in a lot of the Western world perhaps have lost a little bit, that sense of home, that sense of having been your generations of family. And then when that is all disturbed and turned upside down, most people don't want to leave their homelands. If they're driven out by war or, unfortunately, economic problems, that's what drives people out. But mainly, if they can work in relative safety, they want to stay in their homeland.
So, how many Christians are we talking about? How many Catholics are remain in these
Well,
places?
Iraq, for example, is a good figure from in the 2003 war, from the invasion in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein. There were probably an estimated around about 1.2, maybe 1.3 million Christians. That's Catholics and Orthodox mainly in Iraq. Now really it's less than 100,000. It's really, I often use the figure of the World Wildlife Fund. They have certain areas for the extinction of animals when you get to a certain stage. And Christians in Iraq now are at the most endangered
Hmm.
stage of a species. The Iraqi bishops are working on a plan of estimating that in the end there'll end up being around about 50,000 Christians, which is but there'll be a remnant. There'll always be Christians there, and this is the other history of the Middle East, John. That because despite these persecutions, intense persecutions, even if Christians maybe are driven out almost completely, they do return. I know one lady whose family, in the space of three generations, was driven out three times, but they've come back because, as I said, they have a sense that this is their homeland too, and they have a right to be there. They were there before, long before Islam. That's the funny thing I'm in America, for example, and I'm speaking, and often Americans don't. They often come to me and say, "Well, when did we bring the gospel to Iraq?" And you have to say, "You didn't we didn't bring the gospel to Iraq. They brought the gospel to us." I mean, there were five popes from the area of Syria, in around the seventh century. Five. The Catholic Church. The word Catholic, as you know, means universal, and perhaps we've become a little bit parochial. I mean, it'd be wonderful. That's when we're thinking about a new pope. If we had a pope from the true outskirts or from the Middle East. People say, "Oh, we might have an African pope." Well, we've had African popes. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we had African popes. So that sense of the church is not a Western church, really. The church that was born in the Middle East. We call the Middle East the cradle of Christianity because that's where it was born. We are Semitic. We really are Semitic. And that for a Catholic, I think that's one of my jobs, is to try to help Catholics, especially in the West, in America and England, English-speaking world, to realize these are our roots. And St. John Paul II had a great saying. He used to speak about the church breathing with two lungs, the lung of the West and the lung of the East. He was mainly talking at that stage about the lung of the East, as in behind the Iron Curtain,
Hmm.
etc. But now, really, we're talking about the church breathing with two lungs, the West and, yeah, the East again, the Middle East, the place where it was born. And if the church breathes with only one lung, there's something is missing. So we're back to the beginning of the conversation of, in a sense, why it's important that we have a sense of our roots, and our Jewish roots are very important.
Well, we should come to that. I mean, the question of whether the next pope would come from the Middle East seems like a shocking, exotic, foreign thought to many of our listeners, perhaps. Though on a trip that we were able to enjoy together in Israel, we sat together with a cardinal, Cardinal Pizzaballa, who some predict may actually be on the short list as the church considers its future leadership.
He is what is called papabile, means, yes, a possible pope. There's a lot of conjecture. We were joking before we began the recording of the interview that there's an old saying that if you go into the conclave, which elects a pope, if you go into the conclave, a pope, you come out a cardinal.
Mhm.
So there are a number of names being thrown around as possibilities, but Cardinal Pizzaballa, which we also enjoy, his name, he's an Italian, even though he's Pizzaballa means literally ball of pizza, pizza ball. But he's lived in Israel for, I believe, more than 30 years, even though he's in Italian. He speaks fluent Hebrew,
Yeah,
which is really, I think, fascinating. And he's a man who
I
has.
think he has a PhD from Hebrew University.
Does he? Yeah,
So
I just know yes, and we met with him, but I think it was before he was a cardinal, but we met with him, and in the last year or 2 years since October the 7th, his stature in the church has grown considerably. You remember he offered himself actually to take the place of some of the hostages, which wasn't a PR stunt, I don't think. He has a very difficult role, of course, as he did speak to us about trying to balance relationships between Israel and the Palestinian authorities, but also the Christians who were in Gaza, who were under the thumb of Hamas, which was extremely difficult. But I think it would be, he's definitely, in my mind, a candidate who would bring something really, really interesting. A man who's immersed himself in, and I think he's quite, you would know better than I, but I think he's quite well regarded in Israel. Obviously, he has a difficult job trying to represent the Christian community, but he's a diplomat. But he's not a diplomat who won't tell the truth. He tries to balance everything out. So if he walked out on that day, that onto the loggia, as it's called, the balcony, when they announced the Pope, if he walked out, I think we would have an interesting future.
Well, that for sure. How is he regarded among Israelis in the Jewish world? That's hard to say. As you say, I think he reflects a set of dilemmas that are foisted upon his shoulders by the fact that his primary obligation, of course, is to the church, and some of its members would be horribly persecuted if they were to protest too vigorously against the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And therefore, he has a primary responsibility to protect them. And that at times means saying things and undertaking actions that to Israeli ears and to Jewish ears are not entirely fair. Though I have to say that one would have to acknowledge that he's a tremendous improvement over some of his predecessors in that role. I think he's an interesting person. I suppose my question would be where you think he would fall on some of the larger civilizational questions with which we began. Of course, for us, for the Jewish community, the church's relations to Israel and to global Jewry are important, but I would say that questions related to the Catholic confidence in the strength of the West and preserving the identity of the West is perhaps just as, if not more important, even than that.
I agree, and I think this is a it's like every American election, every presidential election. They say this is the most important. Everything it depends on this election, and then we all go on to the next one, and that's the next most important one. But we're at a really important. We are at an important moment in the history of civilization. Um, I think he is considered quite moderate. He's intelligent, which is important, obviously. He is orthodox, as we say in the Catholic world, with a small o, in terms of he will hold to traditional teaching. He's certainly not veers towards the right or the left. So in that sense, he's a good centrist. Um, I think he would be, and who am I to say? But I think he would be because he's Italian, at least by birth, he would be still seen as a European, but because of the length of his time, the majority of his life, I think he just had his 60th birthday, so
Hmm.
half his life in the Middle East, in Israel, he would bring a perspective that the church, I think, needs. I would have a lot of hope that he would speak with one of the problems, and I don't want to criticize the former pope, but a lot of people, a lot of Catholics felt there were problems because he was not clear on certain issues. He didn't speak with clarity. And it's a particular characteristic of the Jesuits. He was a Jesuit that perhaps sometimes they blur the lines a little bit. And the Pope famously said, the former Pope, Pope Francis said, that he wanted people to make a mess. It was one of his quotes, make a mess. Well,
Hmm.
fair enough, but maybe we don't need a mess now, and we need, certainly Catholics, a lot of Catholics feel we need clarity because, and the Pope did, Francis did speak on certain issues like transgenderism and things like that with clarity on abortion. The media tended to never focus on that. They didn't like that. They wanted to hear him say something a little outlandish, and it will be fascinating, in fact, if the next pope is, which I'm hoping and most likely is pretty much straight down the line, how the media will react to that. They will probably be immediately begin attacking him as right wing and reactionary. But in fact, we'll just say no, he's actually just being a Catholic.
Yeah.
But I think Pizzaballa would be solid.
And I mean, to come to it, to me, it seems that one of the great questions confronting the church at this moment is whether it understands itself as having a role to play in the ongoing transformation of Europe and the restoration of European moral confidence to reclaim its civilizational future. And the question of immigration, Muslim immigration into Europe, and the capitulation of European institutions to a completely different culture, laced with jihadi sensibilities at times, is one of the most important cultural questions that we face. And it seems to me that Pope Francis was uh, saw himself as a loving person who is welcoming to the persecuted of all nations. That is one of the core areas in which he, to me at least, leaves an unclear legacy. And whether a person like Cardinal Pizzaballa, were he to be elevated in this way, would take a different stance on that frontier question of who belongs where and whether the church has a role to bolster European confidence in itself.
Well, both John Paul II and Benedict. John Paul famously, when the European Union was, the constitution of the European Union was being created, there was and there is no provision for the historical basis of Europe. The historical basis of Europe is Christian, and they were going to not include that and didn't include it. John Paul spoke very strongly, as did Benedict. There's a vacuum. I think Benedict used that word. There's a vacuum in Europe, and as we know, vacuums have to be filled somehow.
Right.
As Europe has moved away more and more into increasingly secular, Europe is increasingly secular. And what is filling that vacuum? Well, Islam is certainly filling that vacuum in many cities, many countries in Europe. And the church, the Catholic Church in Europe, is in many ways in retreat, although there's a new sign recently certainly in the last year or two, and particularly around the time that we're celebrating now, Easter, there's been notable reports of large numbers of people returning to church, young people in particular. And I think this is critical. This is what the cardinals need to discuss, because sometimes the church should always be behind the times, in the sense of, I think Chesterton said something like, we don't want a church that moves with the world, we want a church that moves against the world. We swim upstream, not
Right, right,
downstream,
right.
especially when the culture is bad. But I think this is very important for the cardinals to be considering. Why are young men and women, large numbers comparatively speaking, coming to the church? They're not coming to the church to be told the Western world is great and all that you're doing is great. They're seeking an alternative, and whoever the next pope is needs to realize this, and does need to be someone who fights for the future. Benedict XVI, when he was just Cardinal Ratzinger, way back in the 1960s, when he was Father Ratzinger, he wasn't even a bishop then. He famously wrote in the 1960s that the church of the future in Europe would be what he called a creative minority. And that's reality. We are becoming a minority of actively practicing Catholics. For example, in England, where I'm sitting at the moment, there are 60 plus million people, but of all the Christians who go to church every week on a Sunday, there's around 2 million, which is tiny. Soon there may well be more Muslims going to the mosque than Christians. So yes, we're a minority. The question is, will we be a creative minority? And that's what I'm hoping for, a man who realizes we need to be creative. And part of being creative is not acquiescing to the spirit of the world, the spirit of thinking that, yes, we must be more like the secular world. No, the opposite. People are coming in large numbers because they want an alternative. And the next pope must be a man, even if he's from Africa, wherever, who understands that about Europe.
I think back to when Pope Benedict XVI gave this famous Regensburg lecture, in which he took on the question of the Catholic relation to Islam head on. And as a Jew who's paying attention to these debates, to which I'm a foreigner, to which I'm an onlooker, I have to say that he seemed to understand, Pope Benedict XVI seemed to understand something of great significance when he gave that lecture. And that is part of that lecture had to do with very deep metaphysical questions. But part of it also recognized the civilizational structure which made the space for the church to do its work, and that needed to be tended and preserved as well. And I would say that that one could say the basis of Europe is Christian, um, as a historical matter. For European Christians to now be able to undertake the deep moral formation that the church offers, there does need to be carved out and protected a civic space. And on this question, I think Jews and Christians are absolutely on the same side. This is something in which I think there's a tremendous amount of work to do, both here now in America and in Europe, to carve out the space in which religious institutions can undertake the fundamental work of moral formation. Um, the question, the view of the Pope on that question, the next Pope on that question, will be of tremendous significance to both of our communities.
I agree 100%. And, I remember a quote, I'm looking at it now, that of the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, when he said, anti-Semitism is the best warning sign that we can have of a threat to liberal civilization. Obviously, he meant traditional, the true understanding of liberalism. And I remember many, many years ago, probably nearly 10 years ago, Cardinal Dolan of New York said that the greatest support he'd received at that point, in terms of the persecution of Christians, which was exploding, as we know, he said was from his Jewish friends, from various rabbis and representatives of Jewish organizations, because there's that old sense, that old, again, the old phrase in the Middle East that first they come for the Saturday people and then they come for the Sunday people. And Jewish organizations understood what was happening to Christians. The difference is in the West that there's this crackdown on religious freedom for everybody to speak in the, as you said earlier, in the public square, and that is a great area of collaboration that we should be, and even with Muslims as well, sharing, at least when we share beliefs in the family and the meaning of life, etc. We need to come together. That's an important. We might not agree on various theological points, but we need to come together on those sort of things from that a sense of shared values and beliefs. When there are many people, including governments and government organizations and the world of academia, which don't just they don't just not share those beliefs, they're actively opposed to them. They see them, in fact, as abhorrent. And so we are, I think you might have used the word civilizational battle, but there is a battle going on, back to the Pope. The next man ought needs to realize that, and when you go into a battle in that sense, sometimes you need a warrior. I've been praying, my personal prayer at the moment is we need a figure like a Gregory the Great for our audience, and who perhaps don't know the history of the church. Gregory the Great he's called great. It's a title very few popes get because over history he's seen as great. Gregory the Great was a man who was pope in the 6th century, when Rome was sacked, when Rome was overrun. Gregory the Great had to fight to literally save the church. And I don't think it's being too I don't think it's pushing it too far to say we need a man of that stature. Whether we get him is another matter, but the time is serious, and at a time when clarity is needed. As I said, the last thing we need is confusion.
Father Ben, you were speaking a few minutes ago about the the setting in which Christianity is born and grows to maturity, theological maturity, cultural maturity, and that setting is the Middle East. Um, Here too, I think that most of our North American listeners will tend to associate Christianity primarily with Europe and not the Middle East. Nevertheless, there has been a very conscious effort among friends of mine, you among them, who have tried to restore the Catholic and Christian roots, to their proper origins. And that does lead to the question of what role Judaism plays in the Catholic imagination and how you understand it. Um, Obviously, Vatican II and the document Nostra Aetate has been transformational for the Jewish and Catholic world. But that operating at the level of policy is something else. I'm curious about theologically and culturally how Catholics now understand Judaism and what role you think it plays in the way in Catholic self-understanding.
I return once again to that figure of John Paul II. I love his phrase. I think he was the first one to really use it, or certainly to popularize it when he spoke of Jews as our elder brothers in the faith. Um, you don't have to think too theologically or too deeply. That everyone understands what that means. That we were born out of Judaism. It's as simple as that. So we don't just cut that off and forget about it. And so, for example, Catholics should be. I'm part of an organization called Catholics Against Anti-Semitism. I think you were at that first conference. We have to be involved in the defense of all people, but particularly this explosion of anti-Semitism. And I think theological issues perhaps can't be solved. I think one of the things we do have to do is speak honestly and say sometimes there are things we have to say, well, these are not going to be resolved, where we have completely opposing views in a sense. Obviously, some of them are just too obvious to even need to say. For example, if Jesus was the Messiah, you'd be a Christian. Jews don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. That's just a fact. So, however, all those other things, uh, our roots are Jewish, our scriptures, what we call the Old Testament is your Bible, the Jewish Bible. Um, we didn't just cut off our roots. Perhaps there were times in history, unfortunately, when that happened, but the real change is a sense of, as I said earlier, it's important for Christians in the West to realize where our roots are. It's a real the, the Catholic faith suffers. The practice of the Catholic faith suffers when Catholics don't realize where they're from, when they do think that it's Western, entirely Western, because it isn't. That's just factual. So our relationship with our Jewish elder brothers is a relationship, I think, of hopefully of growing respect and of affection and mutual support without glossing over differences, because that's not helpful, and that's actually not really respectful to pretend those differences are important. We mustn't pretend they're not important, and when we perhaps try and gloss them over and say they don't matter, we don't believe. And obviously, Jews don't believe that all religions are the same. They all are equal and are the same. We don't believe that. That's a falsity. That's not Christian or Catholic doctrine. Um, but that mutual respect and support is tremendous.
Father Ben, uh, the question of Judaism as and its religious expression is one thing, and the question of Israel and Zionism is another. Here too, Pope John Paul II, the Catholic Saint John Paul II, had a transformational papacy on this score as well. Could you say something about how the church stands in relation to Israel now and where you think that might look in the future?
Well, it's still tricky. Yes, John Paul, we forget that there have only been diplomatic relations between the Vatican, which is a state, a small city state, but the Vatican and the Holy See, as it's called, and Israel since 1993, again, during the papacy of John Paul II. And then his famous visit in 2000, the year 2000, when he went to Yad Vashem and various other places. And as I said earlier, it was very important because he was training as a priest as a young man in Poland during the Nazi occupation. He had Jewish friends, and he had Jewish friends who obviously disappeared and died. He was profoundly and were murdered. He was profoundly affected by this, and his visit, I think, to Yad Vashem, which was quite a long visit. He stayed, I think, over the time, etc. I think that touched many people in Israel. Um, there are still tricky questions. I've been doing a little bit of research ready for this program, but um, obviously they're often more to do with in terms of Catholic Vatican. official relations between the Catholic Church and Israel are often more now to do with things like property issues and things like that. There is of course, the theological question. Yes, Zionism and anti-Semitism. There's no place really, I believe now, for even being anti-Zionist, because it's a sort of now a cover for anti-Semitism, really. But the state of Israel is a secular state. Um, it's a as I said about not glossing over issues. There's a problem perhaps for the church to say the state of Israel as such the is God's plan, is the response to God's wish for the Jews to return to their homeland. Although Benedict the XVI, again, he said on the 60th anniversary of the Jewish state, quite interesting words, that the Holy See, although he's talking about the political entity of the church, gave thanks to the Lord that the aspirations of the Jewish people for a home in the land of their fathers have been fulfilled. So we can give thanks, the Pope said, to God for the fact that Jews have returned home. Um, we're into more tricky territory when we get into this is part of that area when we start talking theologically about the place of the state of Israel as a state in terms of theology.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it would be unfair to expect Catholics to adopt Jewish positions about the meaning of Israel. What the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of our fathers means to us, I don't deny. I celebrate and cherish. And I think it really does mean that there is some kind of unfolding providential hand at work in the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in this land. But I don't understand exactly how Catholics think of it and understand it. The question, the statement that Pope Benedict XVI made that you just recalled for us, I find to be very welcome and very encouraging. So, how would you characterize the tricky theological dimension of Zionism?
Well, first, I would say this whole question is TBC, to be continued.
Yeah.
We will work on this for probably maybe a couple of centuries still, long after we're gone, John. But it for a Christian, for a Catholic, an Orthodox Christian, um, as I said about speaking the truth theologically, uh, we would I use often the example of Saint Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who was always boasting in the Acts of the Apostles about what a good Jew he was. He's quite a boaster, He's always talking about how he was the best of all the Jews, and certainly his heritage was extraordinary. But the belief, the Orthodox Christian belief, is that ultimately all will come to Christ, to Jesus Christ. So, in God's providence, how the state of Israel works into that is for us a question. Yes, Benedict the XVI, that statement is can be read in multiple ways, but it's certainly a way of saying we thank God that Jews have got somewhere to go and have returned to their home.
But you see that I can understand a Christian friend reasoning as follows, which is, I think, not the only, but one of the dominant ways in which the not altogether Catholic and in some ways, syncretic, general Americanized Christianity does sometimes process Zionism. But it could reason as follows. You see, God has, by the establishment of Israel, by the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in that land, God has demonstrated in history that God keeps his promises. And if God keeps his promises to them, to his chosen people, then I have reason to believe that God will keep all of his promises, including the ones that are essential to me. And it establishes a kind of witness for God's ongoing providence in general in history. And that, again, I don't know that that's the way that Christians reason about Zionism, but I can imagine that kind of theological line of thinking.
That's true, and this is sometimes where, again, for your audience, there isn't obviously one position. There's quite a different, often from many Protestants. For example, as you know well, I mean, there are many Protestants who are extremely positive about Israel, but that's not necessarily from a reason that the ordinary Jew would want. It's because many Protestants believe that the state of Israel will bring on the return of the Messiah, bringing the end times.
Yes.
We are not part of that is not Catholic teaching at all. So uh, the theological questions are deep, and not I'm not qualified to speak about them, really. But I think what's important is to say, as I said already, that how far we've come, which is in our lifetime, but the lifetime even of our parents, but from before that, is extraordinary how far
Mm-hmm.
we've come. And who knows what the future will bring. But there may well, and there are things that are unlikely ever to be agreed upon. But living with that in a spirit of peace and concord, and a spirit of mutual respect is important. But it is, I think it really is important to stress how far we've come. Even you and me talking like this, I mean, probably just 100 years ago, not that there'd be none of we wouldn't have the technical ability, but the reality it just wouldn't happen. It
Mm-hmm.
just wouldn't happen. So, and this is very interesting, similar. It's another territory, but for example, we can't really have this kind of dialogue with Islam either. It's not possible. We can have some, again, mutual respect and a certain mutual assistance in terms of, for example, Islam and the Holy See work quite well together in the 90s at the UN on attacks on the family and on life. But theologically, it's almost impossible to have theological discussions with Islam. That's just a fact.
Father Ben, I began by acknowledging that the interest of Jewish observers in the election of the next pope naturally does not track altogether with the way that Catholics themselves think about the priorities the next pope will have to assume. So I'd just like to ask you, as we round out our conversation, to give us some kind of insight, to draw back the curtain and explain how you think about the most important priorities that the church is now going to have to confront in its next chapter.
We have, as we've spoken about all the way through this, particularly in the West, we're facing a civilizational crisis as Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, belief in one God, and particularly in the dignity of humanity. Why a human is essentially dignified, a person of dignity, because they're created in the image of God, image and likeness of God, from the book of Genesis. That is a belief that is challenged. We're looking at the technological advances, the surrogacy, the creation of baby. We're looking at extraordinary things, and this is a civilizational moment which needs that clarity. We're looking in the West again for the church internally, preaching and speaking and teaching with a clarity and an honesty. To a certain extent, I think the next pope is going to have to be perhaps a more, I'm trying to think of the right word. I didn't want to say aggressive, but I think he's going to have to be a lot more he's going to have to challenge the prevailing zeitgeist, as it were, in the West, and in terms of our heritage, working with all of us who believe in those values, those things that are important: the dignity of humanity, the dignity of the human person. There's a theologian, I think, from Cambridge University, who said that for the church has had three great crises. Very early on, the crisis was who is Christ. So the church had to. We're in the 1700th anniversary this year of the Council of Nicaea, which defined who Christ was for Catholic Christian understanding. First crisis. The second crisis was in the Reformation. What is the church? And this professor has said we're now in the crisis, which actually is not just, as I said, part of the church's question, but the church has to teach about it. What is man? Because these questions about what is a human being, these are civilization. That is a civilizational question, which could lead to horrors that which would make the last 100 years seem insignificant. So the next man has got a lot to deal with, but these are issues, and he must be a Catholic believer who wants to spread the faith and to spread it beautifully with love and with charity and with devotion, but with conviction. So again, to sum up, I would think the man has to be. There's a saint who had a lovely phrase. He said that a Christian must be an iron fist in a velvet glove. But the iron fist's got to be there. Otherwise, the glove's all mushy and nothing. If the glove's just velvet, there's nothing. So he's got to be. There's got to be a bit of force there with the next man. So for us, Christians, Catholics, that's what we're praying for, I hope.
This conversation was recorded on April 23rd, 2025. Father Ben, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, John. Bless you.